Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It's a pleasure to be able to connect with Jeremy Saltan, a person who has great connections to Chicago. Many of us knew the Terran family. His mother is a Terran or was a Terran, and his grandparents were significant members of our community for so long, and it's still part of the community as well. Jeremy serves a very important role. He's the Knesset faction director for the Yamina Party in Israel. He's actually coming to us directly from his office in the Knesset. And as people know, there's a lot of exciting things happening in Israel today, even with the Yamina Party, with Ayelet Shaked taking over the leadership from Naftali Bennett, their merger together with Derech Eretz to create the Zionist spirit faction and our political party, and I'm sure Jeremy will correct me on that. And Jeremy, as well, is a political analyst. He's been an advisor for legislative affairs. He was with both Yamina, before that with Bayit Yehudi. He has his master's degree from Hebrew University in international security and diplomacy. And most importantly, he has a handle on what's going on today in the Knesset. So it's really my pleasure to welcome you, Jeremy. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Of course, it's a pleasure to be with you, Rabbi.
So let's just start from the beginning. You know, it's exciting times in politics in Israel. Israel is headed to another set of elections. It appears that former Prime Minister Netanyahu still wants to be future Prime Minister Netanyahu, and there seems to be a lot of conversation about that. In Yamina, which you're involved in, which is as the name implies, a right-wing party. Where do they stand with future coalitions? What's happening today?
Well, right now you have an interesting race, not that there's ever a dull race when it comes to Israeli politics, but at this point we are now in our fifth election in the last 3 years. Now, in terms of the candidates for prime minister this time around, you have, as you mentioned, Netanyahu, you have Lapid, who's the current prime minister, after Naftali Bennett, the previous prime minister, honored his rotation agreement with Lapid. And then you have a third candidate, Benny Gantz, the current defense minister, who is also the previous defense minister during Netanyahu's last government. Now, when it comes to all three of those candidates for prime minister, what we've said in the Yamina Party and now in the Zionist Spirit faction, which is composed of both the Yamina Party and the Derech Eretz Party, the two parties together, running together on a joint slate in this election, is that we are looking, instead of having a narrow government where only one side wins, to find a path forward towards a national unity government in which we'll have parties and individuals of both blocs in the next government. We believe that that is the most important thing moving forward, and that's why we do not intend on nominating any of those prime minister candidates when it comes to this election.
Now, it's interesting. I was reading yesterday in the newspaper that a number of the parties are talking about trying to create a coalition that would exclude Shas and United Torah Judaism. Has Yamina taken a position on that?
Yeah, of course. We've said that every single party in the Knesset that accepts Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is a partner, a potential partner in the next coalition government that we would like to see for the state of Israel. So that includes everybody, including Shas and UTJ, the ultra-Orthodox parties. The only party that does not include, the only list that does not include, is, of course, the Joint Arab List, which were part of the current opposition and have been a part of every opposition since their foundation. And they, of course, do not accept Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And that's why they are the only exception in which they're a party we will not welcome and not tolerate as part of the next coalition.
Now, part of your expertise is polling and the polling data. If you were putting on your prophecy hat, how does it look in the polls? What does it look like will come out if the election were taking place today?
Well, it's very dangerous to expect that what's 90 days before an election is going to be what happens on election day. But if we are going to look at the current polls and imagine that those are the final results, so pretty much what they say is that nobody gets to that magic number of 61. Why is 61 important? We have 120 seats in the Knesset, in order to produce a majority, you need to be able to find 61 votes to endorse a new government. Right now, neither side, not Netanyahu, nor Lapid or Gantz, have any coalition or potential coalition that gets up to 61 seats. And if you will, that's where our current party strategy comes into play, where we say the only way to avoid a sixth election, another snap election after this current election that will take place on November 1st, is for us to be able to find a way to break off parties from both sides and create some sort of coalition government in the middle. Because if we try to go according to what everyone is saying at this moment and try to go back in the old-fashioned blocks as we know them, so that is a sure way to send us towards that sixth election.
Now, the Yamina party, which is more to the right, in the current Knesset, was part of a coalition that included the Arab Ram party, which was a first time that something like that had happened. Is it something that you would project that the Arab Ram party would be included in a future coalition as well?
It's possible that they will be. One thing that I can tell you in terms of our position with Ram moving forward, and this comes from the past experience of going through this past year plus in this government, and that is that they cannot be the deciding votes, meaning we need to get 61 seats without the Ram party. If we already know that we have 61 seats without them, then they can be a partner in terms of, again, a larger part of a national unity government in which you're able to have a lot of representation and not have one of those narrow 61 MK governments like we had this time around and like Netanyahu had 2 times around ago, in which you are just not able to move. There's a problem when they are the ones having the deciding votes. However, if they're there in order to increase the majority, then we're in a place where we can help them do things for their constituency without them being a, if you will, a flight risk in terms of the next coalition moving forward. And we have heard in the past, although currently Netanyahu rules this out, that in the past Netanyahu was willing to bring in Ra'am into even one of his coalitions. So in terms of past records on this issue, this is something that Gantz, Lapid, and Netanyahu have all been willing to do at one point or another. Our position is a little nuanced in that we're willing to do it again, but not with them being the deciding votes in the next coalition.
Now, in many of the polls that I've seen, there were projections of what would happen in the elections if former Prime Minister Netanyahu would pull out. Is that at all a possibility?
I don't see that being a possibility. Yeah, there are scenario polling, which is, again, something you're going to see 90 days out. I should say, just so that, the viewers and listeners understand in terms of the Israeli political process, the submission of the lists, the final candidate lists, take place on September 15th. That's 47 days before the election. So we're still at a point where you have mergers, you have splits, you have people deciding that they're going to bow out, you have people transferring between parties, you have new players announcing that they are joining the political process and are running for office. It is a very fluid time. Because of that, you have people checking various scenario polls to see what would happen if. And obviously the key there is if. If Netanyahu would decide to step aside, it's very clear there would be a very large right-wing majority in terms of the parties within Knesset, as opposed to the current polls with the current configuration in which, like I said, Netanyahu is struggling to get to that magic 61 number. But even if he would be able to make it, that would be a very narrow coalition, the same issues that we dealt with in this outgoing coalition. And Netanyahu himself has dealt with 61 MK coalitions in the past, and he's not been able to really do that much in those type of cases. To quote one of the party members of Zionist Spirit, having a 61 MK coalition is pretty much the same as going into another election, because you won't be able to get anything done anyway.
Mm-hmm. And former Prime Minister Bennett, after he passed over the premiership to Prime Minister Lapid stepped down. Was that a surprise? Was it surprising that he moved out of politics for the moment?
Well, he hasn't completely left politics. He's still the alternative prime minister. That's sort of like vice president for you Americans and Chicagoans there, in which he's the number two. If you will, he's always a heartbeat away from returning to the office of being prime minister. But besides that, he still has other responsibilities. He's technically the religious services minister. He's also settlements minister. He also has the ministry that deals with Iran-related affairs. And of course, that's a very important issue, Iran, when it comes to the security issues there. And Lapid, being a new prime minister, relies a lot on Bennett when it comes to those issues. And besides all of that, he's also a regular Knesset member. He's a member of parliament. I saw him here today, walking the corridors of Knesset, as usual, showing up for work in Israeli's parliament and doing his work here. So to say that he's completely gone and that he's left is not completely accurate. What he has said is that he will not be running in the next election, right? What's happening November 1st here in Israel, meaning he's going to complete his term, but he's not going to seek office in the next election. In terms of the transfer of power between Bennett and Lapid, there were a lot of people that were surprised to see Bennett honor the agreement. People usually, when they think of Israeli politics, they think of it as being a very dirty business. Of course, those who are perhaps a bit more political savvy might remember that Netanyahu had a rotation agreement with Gantz that he did not live up to, and he just remained prime minister. So when you saw Bennett decide to actually live up to the rotation agreement after the government fell, that was something that was very surprising to a lot of Israelis. Dare I say, on a personal level, I found that very refreshing to see that a politician actually does what he says he's going to do. And in terms of just the differences that we've seen since the transfer of power has taken place, I think that we see that so far, at least in terms of Lapid's tenure as prime minister, things have been very quiet, meaning we haven't really seen a lot of things on the news. Things have been a lot more calm during this process of the beginning of the campaign, where all the parties are again involved in the organizational process before actually dealing with the filing period, which is still about 6 weeks away.
And just shifting the conversation a bit, so how does an Oleg from the United States end up in the Knesset? How did, it's an interesting path you've taken, and you've succeeded beautifully. So what's your story? How did you get from where you were to where you are?
Thank you. I kind of feel it's similar to, a lot of American stories, and the fact that I just went from the bottom of the ladder and I just went all the way up, just really through, hard work. Of course, me coming here to Israel as an Oleb, I'm still coming as an immigrant, and no one did me any favors. Everything I was able to accomplish was because I was able to put in the extra hours, the extra effort, again, figure out a way to be able to show a little bit more skill, build on my growing experience as I was able to succeed in the tasks that were put forth in front of me, and just climb that ladder. I remember, I was in high school when I was involved in my first political campaign. I knocked at the campaign headquarters and I said I wanted to volunteer. I wanted to know what work they had for me. And they gave me some bumper stickers. I went out to the junction on the highway over, by the overpass. And as people were at the traffic light going off to the highway, so I had a, if you will, a captive audience, I went around and I gave out bumper stickers. And apparently that was a good idea, to pick that spot. I was able to give out a lot. I was able to return, and they were surprised that I was already able to finish my product pretty quickly. So they gave me a second round, and I was able to do that really, well. And then they upgraded me to flyers. And then after, bumper stickers and then flyers, they let me organize my first parlor meeting. And then after they saw I was able to bring more people to the parlor meeting that I organized than the other, youth that were going around, they gave me more parlor meetings to be able to go ahead and organize. And throughout the years, I just went up the ranks. I became the head of I later became the head of that, city, of that party office, and then, of the district, of the division. And then I was able to be fortunate enough to be able to be recognized for the work that I was able to do on the ground, and was brought to, work within the Knesset. And I've been very, privileged to be able to work as a parliamentary assistant, as a minister assistant, as a party employee, as I am now, as a faction employee, now the faction director for the governing party of the state of Israel. And again, just going up through a lot of hard work, and just, making sure that throughout the entire time, remembering what it is that I'm doing here, remembering, my Zionist roots, remembering the values, that because of those values, I came to become a part of the Israeli political process. And I think that has been the secret to my success.
Do you have a favorite fun or interesting story from when you began working in the Knesset? Something
Wow.
that'll make it into the book.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many stories. I'll tell you, a lot of the youngsters here, they always like to, crowd around me and ask me to tell old stories. The joke here that some of the people say is that I've been here since 1948. Because this is now the end of the 24th Knesset. We're going into the 25th Knesset. I've been here since the 18th Knesset. Maybe a few times on and off, but pretty much, for the long haul, I've been here for a long time. So I've been able to accumulate a lot of stories. If I'd have to, pick one story, you're asking from like, my first year or something when I was first, starting out, I remember one of the first, pieces of legislation that I worked on that meant a lot to me was dealing with the issue of judicial reform here in this country. We had a very weird piece of legislation that had determined that for whatever reason, you can only be the president of the Supreme Court as long as you haven't yet reached your 67th birthday. And of course, you must retire at the age of 70 because legally we decide that you are senile. So I thought that was a little bit weird, because there was a Supreme Court justice that I was following by the name of Asher Dan Grunis, who was, in my eyes, a better fit and a better, justice that should be president based on the seniority rules. But because of this weird amendment that had been done in one of the previous governments, he would not get a chance, because he would be 41 days after his 67th birthday and would miss out on that privilege. So at the time I was working for a member of Knesset who was in the opposition. It was very hard, of course, to pass through legislation, but I was able to somehow convince a lot of people to co-sponsor, including key members from the coalition and committee chairmen. I was able to convince the Ministerial Committee of Legislative Affairs. I was able to work with the cabinet secretary of the government, and I was able to go ahead and really shepherd and help this piece of legislation through. And again, this was my first piece of legislation that I was helping. And by doing so, I was able to change the identity of who the next president of the Supreme Court was. So, for me to do that as someone who is very young and new, to take such a huge topic and do something that really ended up having a historical impact was a very humbling experience. But it also was an experience that told me already at that point that there is nothing that is impossible. There's the old saying, if there is a will, there is a way. I mean, I was able to do something that most people would have told me from the beginning was impossible, yet I was able to go ahead and do that. And I was, again, very lucky over the course of time to be able to do many other historical things from that point up until today. And, with God's help, Bezrat Hashem, I'll have the chance to be able to do that in the future, depending, of course, on, how things go with my party and, of course, with myself in the future.
So just out of curiosity, is there an age limit now for a Supreme Court justice?
Yes, we weren't able to get rid of the 70 limit. Every Supreme Court justice who gets to 70 must must resign. But we were able to repeal that silly thing that if you're 67, you can't, meaning you're good enough to be a Supreme Court justice, you can remain on the bench, but you're not good enough to be the president of the Supreme Court anymore. So we got rid of, again, that was my, in essence, that was my piece of legislation we got rid of. Yeah, but we still have that thing. Perhaps that would be an easy way to clear up some of the issues that you have in the Supreme Court of the United States. If you put up a cap there and you didn't have to convince people, at various ages that they should resign instead of die in office. So I don't know what the exact answer is, but I do think at least the way things are today and the fact that there are plenty of people who are 70 years old and are certainly not senile. I'm sure there are plenty of people listening and, they're able to work their computers or their phones enough to be able to watch or listen to this broadcast. So I think it's a little bit, ridiculous to expect that at 70, every single person is senile, but that is still the Israeli law up until today.
So in the upcoming elections, what are going to be the driving issues that'll really determine the elections? Sometimes it's security, sometimes it's economy, it's Iran. What are the issues on the table that really make the difference now?
I mean, it depends if you want to go with the gut or go with polls. According to polls, what most Israelis care about is the cost of living. That's a very big issue. The cost of living has gone up as a result of a lot of things that are just not even really in our control. Of course, this is something they're dealing with the United States as well. In terms of what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, the whole situation with China, you have many contributors on the global level that have ended up hurting the regular person in his pocket. So there are many things that people want to see in terms of the cost of living to be able to bring prices down. There's, of course, the usual argument that you have between, more free market capitalist to more concentrated socialist or social democratic type economic structure. There are a lot of disagreements going on that level. You also have arguments on the situation of how to resolve the housing crisis. We have a very, 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 very big sellers market at the moment. It's been going on like this for about a decade and a half. We sort of feel that we're in some sort of a bubble. There's a lot of questions about how to do that in the smart way because many people my age, including myself, are just not, homeowners, right? I look at my friends who I went to school with in Hillel Torah, and they Baruch Hashem, most of them are homeowners. When I look at my classmates, and I look at even my classmates, from my master's, and I've been talking about high school people here, but from Hebrew University, which is one of the top universities around the globe. Many of them are still not homeowners. So again, you have this issue here where this is a very big thing that needs to be solved. But like I said, that's what the polls say. The polls say that cost of living and housing crisis are the most important issues. However, if you look at what's going on in terms of the campaign ads that we're seeing, being spread at this current point in time, it's mostly about yes, Netanyahu, no Netanyahu, who you're sitting with, who you're not sitting with, coalition math, the horse race, and then, of course, issues of identity politics in terms of the identity of a person as opposed to what actually their political opinions are. So I would really like to see a campaign which is reflected by what we see in the polls in terms of what Israelis tell us that they care about. But at least right now, at this part of the campaign, and I fear this could continue, we're talking very little about substance, but mostly about things that really have nothing to do with people's political opinions or actual voting records, or in terms of what their plans are in terms of the future.
It's fascinating that the question of one state, two states, the status of the Palestinians, the question of Iran, the strength of the army, etc. None of those are on the table in terms of real political conversation.
No, I mean, those issues, if you will, the way I always like to explain it is the right won, meaning we won those arguments. If you look at the outgoing Knesset, 72 of the 120 Knesset members are from right-wing parties. Now, there is a split there where, of course, 52 MKs supported Netanyahu and 20 MKs were right-wing MKs that supported this government. But in terms of the right versus left argument, the right has won. Just about everyone agrees in terms of what our policy should be in terms of Iran. Just about everyone agrees with our policy in terms of the fact that there is no Palestinian state that we can see being created, even within not just the near future, but I would say even the distant future. I don't see really even people in the center suggesting that that's something that's in the cards. And all of the traditional things that we were used to seeing in Israeli politics in terms of the right versus left arguments from 10, 15, even 20 years ago, those seem to be really much right now, at least on the down low, on hold, or have just, at least based on what I believe, have already been decided. And that's why you have different fault lines and you have different issues in terms of this election, in terms of what both the politicians, but also in terms of what the voters are looking for. Because whether you're on the winning side or the losing side when it comes to these issues, the great majority of Israelis have accepted the current situation the way that it is.
And one last question, because our time is really coming to an end. Nowadays, there are basically two religious Zionist parties, and yet you'll find religious Zionist members of all of the other parties. It's no longer that split, whereas it may be different in the Haredi world where you'll have the classic Haredi parties. Do you think there's a future for a religious Zionist party of the type like of a Mafdal, where most religious Zionist Jews would join that party versus being part of Yamin or Likud or any of the others?
I think it's very important, the trend that you're mentioning, that we now see religious Zionists in practically all the parties, of course, excluding the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab parties, and of course, the far-left parties. Everyone else has at least one, if not a couple or even few MKs that have come out of, the religious Zionist school of thought and, of course, programs. I think that when I look at the model, and again, as you mentioned before, I come from, as one of the stops on my political journey, working for the Beit Yehudi, the Jewish home, which was the continuation of the Mafdal. I think that the problem that we ended up seeing is that in order for a party like that to really work, and at the times that it did work, and it was able to bring double digits in terms of the percentage of the vote and in terms of our Knesset representation, were during the years where there was a clear representation of all streams within religious Zionism. Because it's not just one lane. You have a little bit of a spectrum there. You have people who consider themselves more Torani. You have people who consider themselves more on the liberal, if you will, more modern Orthodox, Rav Soloveitchik, type of a religious Zionism here in Israel. And unfortunately, what has happened to the current party that now carries the name of religious Zionism is that it's very much only on one side, which is the Torani side. It might have, one or two people within what can be considered the mainstream, but there's no one on, if you will, the more modern Orthodox side of the spectrum. You don't really have, there are no current people who can consider themselves the students of a more Rav Soloveitchik, school of thought. I would definitely consider most of the people there, even though they're part of the Torani side, a lot more in line with the Rav Moshe Feinstein type in terms of their, hashkafa. So right now there's actually a primary going on in that party. There are candidates from all sides of the spectrum. This is an opportunity for that party to make their decision in terms of where they are. But based on what I seem to, understand, based on at least the stats that have come out today in terms of the composition of where a majority and who a majority of the people are in that voting body, it would seem that once again, they're going to have a very Torani list. And again, I'm not saying that in a judgmental way. That's completely fine. I'm just saying in order for there to be a future for that type of a party, you have to be able to have the entire spectrum of everyone that are within that lane in order for there to be an actual future for that kind of a party down the road. Because without that, you're going to just continue to see the other parties fulfill those issues for additional parts of people within the spectrum of religious Zionism.
Jeremy, our time is really up, and I want to thank you so very much for your expertise, for your willingness to join us. And I have a favor to ask, if you can please send my regards to your mother, Chani, who is a classmate of mine from Hillel Torah at Ida Crown. And we have to make sure everyone knows that the Terrans are well represented as well on this video. Thank you so much, and continue to do these amazing things you're doing with Yamina and now with the Ruach HaTzionut. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'll definitely say hello to my mother.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.